Hey there, welcome to episode 74 of the Quaggling Sand audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo. We're recording this at just about 1 p.m. on Wednesday, April 9, 2025. Was aiming for earlier this morning, but early afternoon will have to work. Episode 74, we're going to talk about that one reality show, which I may have hinted at in various other episodes, especially if I was ever talking about Makers or Maker Faire or Intel. Some of my world travels. I may have brought this up, but let's do a little behind the scenes. I don't think I'm going to violate any NDAs. I have no idea if they ever had a terminus, but that one reality show. If you're not familiar with Quaggling Sand, by the way, it is a technical term. It refers to that feeling you have in maybe a limb that you were sitting on or leaning on or sleeping on, a hand, an arm, a leg, a foot, etc. Sometimes a head. If you lose sensation, that numbness as it returns, as circulation returns to that part of the body, you will feel what some may call pins and needles, but again, the technical term, which I coined when I was around 4 years old or so, somewhere in there, Quaggling Sand. It's an audio program about stories and reflections. You may find them useful or entertaining, or who knows what. I don't know that there would ever be a guest scenario for Quaggling Sand, but never say never. So on that note, hopefully wherever you found this audio program, you're able to locate the episode description, which contains the show notes, a summary that I will read to you, and some episode-related links. There are the 3 shameless self-promotion and 3 related to today's episode. So let's get to that. The summary is as follows. I may have mentioned before my participation in a reality show called America's Greatest Makers, produced by Intel Corporation, my employer at the time, and Mark Burnett, and focused somewhat on makers, but really on entrepreneurs. It was an interesting experience. The links for today's episode, the first 3, the shameless self-promotion links I referred to, buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, DANHUGO. Profile page has links to all of my audio programs, the top level profile page of sorts at Spotify, which really needs to change. Spotify is okay, but own your brand, people. I should be walking the walk. Buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo profile page is sort of a link tree, but freeform. Links to my various GitHub repositories, affiliate links to some of my favorite coffee beans in keeping with the theme. You are under no obligation to spend any money at any of these shameless self-promotion sites, but any funds that do arrive through these do go towards coffee or coffee accessories. It's what powers my various endeavors. So buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo/posts, POSTS, is where you will find Buy Me an Update, and maybe some other posts as well. But Buy Me a Coffee enables the hosting of audio and video content. So the Buy Me an Update Monday short is a microcast, a micro stream, whatever, of 5 minutes or less. Quick rundown on the previous week's audio programming, the subject matter, and then any announcements or upcoming this or that or the other thing, who knows, 5 minutes or less. Exclusively on buymeacoffee.com, available at buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo/posts, and linked in the link section. Finally, Dan Hugo also on Ko-fi, ko-fi.com. The hyphen or dash is the key next to the 0 on most keyboards. Ko-fi.com/DanHugo, another place where I can engage and communicate with my millions and millions of fans. Once again, no obligation to spend any money. You can if you want, and I will try to do something nice for you back in return. The 3 episode links for today: America's Greatest Makers, a Wikipedia page about the show. The original branded website, americasgreatestmakers.com, is no longer about the reality show. So the Wikipedia page is probably the most reliable place to find anything about it. You can read about the various teams and some other background information, some of the judges. It was an interesting time. So America's Greatest Makers on Wikipedia. The Tech Shop was a makerspace where we produced some of the, it was where we first started the production of the show, and some there was some production happening there. There were a lot of cameras and microphones and the whole nine. It was a multi-story, multi-floor makerspace in San Francisco. It went out of business, and unfortunately, makerspaces, I guess, don't make a ton of money. So the Wikipedia page for Tech Shop, just for some background, just so you know what I'm talking about. And finally, the Arduino 101, long retired, but it was the product from Intel around which the entire America's Greatest Maker production was based. It was built around this maker board, developed in partnership with Arduino. You can't get it anymore. So I do have a link to the Arduino website. In their retired board selection, you can at least see what it looked like, and it'll give you a feel for how big it was, which I'll refer to later. That actually matters for this story. So that's about it for the links. Let's begin. Let's begin so we can end. So the notion of this whole entire thing. I joined the Maker Innovator Group at Intel. Their goals were to make Intel a part of the maker community, and that goes back a bit. Maker Faire, Make Magazine, Make and Craft magazines, I believe. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you heard that. Various Amazon products started talking to me for no reason. So the notion was this, that the Intel was going to enter the maker community, Make Magazine, Craft Magazine, Dale Doherty, the whole nine. So that had been around for a while. Then CEO Brian Krasanich was a fan of makers and making in general. He was also known as BK, if you ever heard that name back then. So he wanted to make Intel part of the future of innovation, starting with younger students and creative individuals, and jumping into the maker community and interacting with that crowd and partnering with Arduino. All made some business sense, but I would suggest, which I will touch on at the end of this episode, it may not have been the best move for Intel, but it was a nice idea. At some point, someone from Intel had a chat with Mark Burnett of Survivor and other reality show fame about producing a reality show around making. And again, just like the other point I'll make at the end of this episode, this would be a very cool idea contemporaneously. So at the time, this would have been very cool, but not as a television production. I think there was an audience mismatch. It was produced for TBS, and I don't know how many people get TBS. If you know what TBS is, a TV network, points. If you don't, you probably didn't see the show. And that's the majority. The notion was to create a financial incentive with prizes for maker teams and projects, which were judged to be the best over several episodes of TV production context. They were judged in the space of like a week, I think it was, when we produced the finale judging and so on. And so, yeah, interesting to see how the sausage is made, as the saying goes, right? I myself had attended several hackathons by this point. I mean, several, like dozens. I put the number at 47 because I don't really know what the real number is. That's probably a good guess. It could be high, it could be low. I was at a lot of hackathons of different sizes and formats and prizes and no prizes and who knows. So I had been working with our Intel Maker products. I had been working with the maker community and so on. So all these hackathons I've been to, many of them were offering some sort of cash or similar prizes, usually as an Amazon gift card, merch from sponsors. So, hey, DJI is a sponsor and you get a free drone, stuff like that. In categories or per some particular event theme. So maybe it was smart home or smart city or conservation or things like this. But this would be slightly different, to say the least. The America's Greatest Makers reality show, that is, a small panel of judges, not necessarily aware of the maker journey in any way, probably not as familiar with hackathons or the whole notion. And they were to pick the winners. Maybe I'm foreshadowing a little bit with that assessment. The beginning of the whole thing, the beginning of the beginning. I was at Maker Faire in New York on behalf of my employer, Intel, and I was approached by one of the VPs about this reality show idea. He was a tall guy named James. If you know, you know. He said, hey, we're thinking about doing a reality show, and would you be able to help us out with that? Yeah, sure. Whether I could play a role helping to get it along or going and maybe participate in the show itself was the question. And as I will repeat later, because of my work situation, my manager was doing his thing and I was basically out and about all the time. Like I was traveling 80 to 100% of the time. 100%, it felt like that. But I was always off. So I really didn't stop to ask permission for things. So I just said, yeah, sure, sounds good. As the details came together and the outreach for applicant teams kicked in, the video submissions for teams and projects began to roll in. I'm not 100% sure, and I don't even know if I did know the final number, but it was maybe something like 700 submissions, maybe more, or maybe basically I remember it being over 500, so 500 to 700 maybe, something like that. It was a lot. The goal was 20 good teams, whatever good meant. So I will let you in on a little secret. Hopefully nobody at Burnett Productions is listening. Good meant good for TV, obviously. It's a TV show. While there were considerations around feasibility of particular submissions, especially given that they would be building on as yet unreleased hardware in the form of the Arduino 101 board, with software tools that were, well, most definitely in development. End of the day, did the teams look good in their videos and were they personable enough to make compelling reality television? If their product looked interesting, or if it, the product, foreshadowing again, project, if their project looked interesting, and if they were able to describe it in a fun and an appealing way, they bubbled up to the closer to being selected. I actually saw some of the videos and they were cool. It was, I don't remember exactly. It was something like, hey, submit a 3-minute video with your team and some description of your project and be personable, something like that. So what was the hardware and what was going on with this? The hardware, the fun part, we were going to be using the recently announced, it had been announced at Maker Faire Rome officially, the Arduino 101. It was an Uno form factor. And again, if you click on the Arduino link at the top of the show that I referred to in the link section, you can see what an Uno looks like. And this was specifically the Arduino 101, but the Uno form factor. It's a maker board, so it's intended to be used for prototypes with wires and so on. It's about the size of a standard deck of playing cards, slightly larger. Actually larger enough so that it's just not the size of a deck of playing cards, if that makes any sense. With the it's not the size, it's not exactly the dimensions of a deck of playing cards, but it's about that size. Kind of fits in your pocket, but not ideal, not for your wrist or things like this. That's important for later. It's got very few, it had very few. It had the very new Intel Curie part on it, eventually called the Quark SE for, I don't even know what SE meant, but the Intel Curie. We were naming our products after inventors and creative people. So the Galileo, the Edison, the Curie, and the Joule, and then the whole group got shut down. Very new, as in not yet shipping when we were doing this. Announced, not yet shipping. As it happens, this hardware is developed under the auspices of my group, the Maker Innovator Group, and I had been in the Arduino home base in Torino, the Officina Arduino, when the design was first conceived. We were sitting with Massimo and some of the other engineers there and our partner vendors from Emutex and people from my group, Intel. I actually spent about 12 days during Thanksgiving in Torino because I knew some of the people from my team in the US would like, what, Thanksgiving? I'm going to be with, and I said, yeah, I know. I get to go without my management and so on being there with me. So I got to know the Arduino crew a little bit better. The goal was an Arduino compatible system with some rudimentary neural net hardware inside the part. So a system on, I think it was a system on module. Internally, it was not one single chip, but so it was not a SOM. The goal was, and again, this was the very early, so it was probably not even cost competitive in any way. It was early days, early production, etc. So the goal was this Arduino compatible system that could run with Arduino development tools, but also with some neural net acceleration hardware. Today, we would just say, AI acceleration. This was, when was this? 2017, 16 maybe, something like that. So it was early days, but it was the functional part that we were going to be using. It was functional and it was useful, mostly. Something to note, if you do happen to know how big the Arduino Uno is, it is not always ideal for wearable devices. We're getting there, which was the basic direction the selected team submissions were taking. They were all going to be wearable or almost wearable, so small was better. Uno is great for hackathons. It's easy to plug wires into the is it the Arduino? Is it shields? They have jumper connectors on the outer, longer sides, so you can plug in wires and so on. No soldering needed. So if you're at a hackathon, it's not so tiny that you're going to lose it. You can put things on it. You can add a shield to it. You can plug wires into it fairly easily. No soldering necessary. So it's great if you're spending a weekend trying some ideas out in exchange for some prizes and accolades and celebration and pizza and Red Bull and so on. But if you're going to build a wearable product around it, not project necessarily, but product, not necessarily ideal. So it's wearable, but wearable stuff or almost wearable, and not great to use in Uno form factor, especially if it was going to be showing off on TV. If you're going to show off something on TV, you want it to look nice, not look like it's, so from my perspective, I was very familiar and comfortable with seeing stuff with wires sticking out and half done and so on. But from the television production perspective, making something that looked cool was probably going to be a better deal than making something that looked super prototype. And that would come up later. The software. Now, when I say software, I mean the tools to make software. So individual teams were producing software around this hardware to implement their project idea. So when I'm saying software, I'm saying the development tools to enable that. This is where things got very political and very messy. The tools. And so here it's kind of interesting because I'm really talking mostly in this episode about the Intel side. Two reasons. One, I'm not in the world of production of reality shows. I was on the set and I was a part of it, but I cannot speak with any real knowledge. I don't have a ton of experience in this area. I was only in one reality show. I was in one episode in particular. Most of the time I think I'm in some still pictures and I'm here and there, but so I can't say I was in the show. And also, I don't really know any of the dirt. I can tell you that reality shows are edited for television. They're edited to be compelling. I can tell you that there was one team that had a little bit of a dramatic falling out. So that made their final presentation for judging and all that stuff a little bit problematic. There was another team that had some other difficulties internally, but I think they made it through. Nothing noteworthy enough to make dramatic, dun, 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 or anything. There was no scuttlebutt to speak of from a television perspective. These were normal people. They were younger people too, so everything is much more important. But the software I can speak to because I had to deal with this. The tools were under heavy development. There was a question whether they would be usable at all in time for production at the start of the reality show. And the reason for this was that even though internally it was a Quark processor, so a single core x86, basically the inside of a Quark processor itself, which was on the Galileo. So programming that part and the IOs would be interesting, but not particularly new. There was an I2S bus, which I think was not brought out, which affected one of the teams. When I say brought out, the specification said there is one, and then the actual implementation, why would somebody want to use that? Maybe because we mentioned it in the specification. Oh, I'm going to use that feature. No, not available? Okay. We may have fixed that later, which I'll get to shortly. But the real tools were about building around this AI engine to accelerate, multiply, and accumulate operations, which is, those are a big deal in the world of artificial intelligence, maths, if you like. So one challenge, the tools would only run on Ubuntu Linux, not Windows, not Mac. This was the official position of the Intel tools team. This meant that all teams have to have access to an Ubuntu system on which to develop their projects. As a Linux nerd myself, I will say that this was a CYA selection to avoid having to deal with questions and support. They just wanted it to work. Like, we're only going to support it if you're using Ubuntu, nothing else. But if you are familiar with Linux, it's a Debian-based distribution, and it probably would have worked just fine as long as you had any of the dependencies in place and so on. And I will tell you what we ended up doing was purchasing, I think we got 25 laptops, like secondhand laptops through some Intel warehouse or something. So they were reasonably priced, but they were still kind of a waste. I mean, there was really no reason to require this purchase. But the idea was we were going to provide each team, 20 teams, so we had some spares, with a running development system. Here's a laptop, Ubuntu installed, development tools work, plug in your Arduino 101 board and start working on your project. So we wanted to minimize, and this is just generally good for supporting your development customers. Wanted them to spend more time working on their project, not on ours. So to that end, side note, I didn't write any of this down, but we had our 25, I think it was 25 laptops. I have a picture that I could probably count them. So I got a switch from Fry's Electronics so I could plug in all of the laptops at the same time. I had a little teeny tiny gigabyte server, literally the size of a Rubik's Cube, like super tiny. I think they still make something like that with more modern processors. This was a little 32-bit x86 server thing. Probably be better with a strong with an ARM part or a RISC-V. I installed a boot P server of sorts, so all of the laptops could boot off of this little teeny tiny Rubik's Cube thing through the switch. They could all boot up at the same time, and I had them all configured to do a installation from the server. So I could basically configure or reconfigure 1 through 25, so either one machine or all of them. So we could configure them so they worked, and we could reconfigure them if at any time during the entire process there was a need to do that. So if the software team and wherever they were based, I think they were based in France, in Toulouse maybe. I think I knew one of the managers involved from my visit there for Edison. Some of the team may have been in LA. Intel being global, like to be able to divide people so they could form their empires more easily. So I had this configuration so that I had this setup so I could do the configuration on any or all of the development laptops at any time. And then somewhere along the way, we said, hey, you know what would be interesting is if we could provide people with a virtual machine that could run on their hardware. So we got most of the way getting a VirtualBox machine image that could run inside the VirtualBox, a hypervisor. So if you wanted to run the tools on your Mac or your Windows laptop or whatever, you could at least run the tools. Getting the USB interface to work was problematic, but you could build your software and all the necessary steps, and then you could download it through a Linux laptop or native hardware that could, anyway, so it was all a work in progress. But my goal was to try to remove the impediments to getting their project working, which is always the goal. That's what hackathon should be about, right? You find out why people don't rush to your product or project. Oh, we make it hard to use when there's a clock ticking, and that's a good indication. So lessons learned there, not by Intel, but certainly by me. So the problem, even if one is using the supported Ubuntu platform, the tools were sort of usable, but the documentation was not. So while we have this moving target of the development platform, like, is it going to work? Does it work reliably? How will we know? Can we check the documentation? We're working on that. Almost no reliable information about the Curie, also known as the Quark SE, nor about the Arduino 101 concerning implemented features. So which pins were brought out to the board, like the I2S bus, which is, it's like I2C, but it's not. It's a 2-wire serial. I think I2S is also 2-wire serial. It's aimed at audio products. And one of the 24 teams, I said 20 earlier, but it was 24. We'll get to that just in a moment. One of the teams was building their entire thing based on the support of the I2S bus. So when that signal was not brought out on the Arduino 101 board, there was like a little bit of concern. And I think we fixed that, and we'll get to that. We'll get to the part where we do this. I do not remember if we ended up supporting that feature, but we should have, because, yeah, we said things we said. so if everything was going to work, it was still a big question mark by the time we actually started production. So we were getting on the train and pulling out of the station, and not all of the cars and the wheels were attached. Good times. So the kickoff of this entire production, the production team was to select 20 contestant teams of 1 to 3 people each. Minors were allowed with a parental chaperone. And there was a nice meetup in up front. I think it was in LA. I think. With the production team, it was in a hotel somewhere in a meeting room, to go over legal, including that $1 million penalty for divulging details of the reality show early. And it may be forever. I don't know if I'm subject to a $1 million penalty for even talking about this stuff, but I don't know if I'm in trouble for making this episode. Who knows? But so it was an interesting meetup. Met the legal people from the Burnett Productions and some other various characters. As it turns out, though, the production team selected 24 teams for even better TV. So during the kickoff, if I remember correctly, I was in line to do something like get my room key or whatever was happening. So I was standing in a line of some sort. And one of the Intel people who was managing the actual Intel side of the production day to day, his name was Carlos, he came up to me and said, "Hey, we have 3 extra teams. So we only have enough mentors for 20 or 21 teams. So we need 1 more because we want to keep it to 3 teams each. So would you be able to be that extra person?" The idea was I was going to be the sort of the product contact, since our team, my group that I was in, the Maker Innovator group, and specifically our team in San Diego, was responsible for the product, not the software tools on that, but the product itself. So I was going to be the contact on site during the production and for all of the teams and for all of their mentors, so that we could aggregate questions, address documentation issues, and all this other stuff. And I really ended up being more an advocate for the contestant teams rather than a representative of Intel to them, but that's a different thing. So I joined with the 7 contractors. I think 1 might have been an employee also, but I know for a fact that we brought in contractors to act as mentors. I say 7, it may have been a little bit more than that, but we did not have enough people to have the extra 3 teams have an individual mentor for them. Mentor, guide, support person, however you want to look at it. So they said, could I do that? And given the way I conducted my days with Intel, I didn't really ask permission so often. So I just said, sure, I'm in. So that led to my doing a little bit extra travel and being much more involved as usual. Initial production was to be at the tech shop in San Francisco, hence the link, which was a pretty nice multi-story makerspace. So multiple floors. We took over the top floor. It was closed for production. I do not remember if we were there for a week, maybe, or longer. Side note, we were staying at a place called the Good Hotel. And I remember saying to the person that booked all that stuff, maybe next time we should stay at the Great Hotel. So you can take that for what it's worth. The makerspace itself was pretty nice. It had a really nice selection of equipment for making things. I think they had just gotten a water jet at that point. Pretty cool. They went out of business, unfortunately, like a year later after production, for whatever that means. We all got badges, and the upper floor was set up for the production with a bunch of couches and some chalkboard art that was very nerdy. Chalkboards were created, the images or the drawings on the chalkboards were created by professionals who actually do that for a living, which was interesting. And so basically we were, getting the lay of the land and all that. We were getting ready to get started. We got our badges. We got some initial briefings on how the place worked and so on. And they set up the production side, set up a producer room. It was multiple large flat displays and cameras. So they mounted little GoPro style cameras on the walls, pointing at different places. People would get mic'd. So they had enough microphones so that they could pick up, some background noise or conversation and whatnot. But sometimes through the day they would mic people. So they would have you come in and they drop the microphone down your shirt and mount the pack on your, on your belt or somewhere. And the microphone would be up near your neck, and you would be picking up audio through the production. So things like that. Well, the early days of getting a show up and running. definitely a TV takeover in the makerspace. So it was kind of interesting, kind of fun, very educational to say the least. What about those teams? I think I was the only employee. Like I said, there may have been one other, but it was mostly contractors who were hired. But I was a direct mentor role for all the teams, like I said. And then there was one team of the three that I was assigned. There was one that was a 15-year-old girl who I will not name, although today she's obviously an adult. As far as I'm aware, she is still at MIT because she was smart like that. Probably still is. I was taken aside by my management and told that their management really wanted an employee to work with this team of one from just liability concerns and whatnot. Now, I will simply say that nobody ever did any background checks on me, but they would have been fine. I have no drama in that regard. But generally speaking, if you're going to be working with minors like that, I believe Intel should have been a little bit more careful. Again, I would have been totally fine. They could have checked me twice even. But if I had to do over, I probably would have said, hey, you know what? You should check just to make sure for everybody. There was a mom there for her. It was her mom, in fact, and she was fine. Her family was great. I actually went to their house, which we'll get to in a second, in New Jersey. But so everything was fine, but it was kind of strange, a little hand wave there. I think Intel could have done it. Well, they could have done a better job about a lot of things, but I think they really should have been as judicious as they thought they were being. I think they should have been more so. I'll just leave it there. The projects that I was responsible for, the teams and the projects, one was a personal data wristband that would work sort of like everybody does the Fitbit stuff. So it was kind of like that, but it would work with those recovering from stroke and other medical issues to track physical movement and improvement. So it was designed that the whole concept was to basically provide feedback during and through a course of physical therapy and other sort of recovery. It was specifically for stroke, but for anything similar to that. And another one was a purse-like device with a programmable display on the outside and other sensors used for an interactive look at me product. I didn't really get into this, but the Curie had a built-in Bosch 9 degree of freedom sensor. They had a Bluetooth. They had, what else? They had a couple of sensors on there. So the Curie part could provide a few different inputs that you could use in your project. So the gyroscope, basically, the 9 degree of freedom, acceleration, rotation. What's the other one? 9 degrees. So there's XYZ, translation, acceleration, and rotation. I can't remember. I think those are the 9 degrees. The definitely rotation and acceleration in the three space. So the sensors were cool for, like you could move the purse around and it could change the display or things like this. The recovery band obviously could measure your physical motion, arm swing, and so on. I don't know if there was an implementation of a pulse measurement. There might have been. And then finally, a blood pressure sensing device designed to function as one might find with a glowing wristband or stuff you find at clubs and so on. It would retain a flat form, almost like a concavity, but like a straight band. And then when you slap it on your wrist, it would curl around your wrist. So this was going to be a blood pressure sensor, or basically a medical sensor that could be applied in an emergency situation by medical EMTs, emergency medical technicians, ambulance, etc. They could just slap it on your wrist and begin capturing data. A very cool idea. The SLAP band, that's the only one I really remember the name of. You can get all the names on that Wikipedia page. I think each project is named. You'll be able to figure out which and what and who and where. Other teams were sized from 2 to 3 people. So 2 of my teams were 2 people each and one was 1 person. Some younger, some older. They included projects like a dairy cow herd. I wrote herd with an A because I'm dumb like that. A herd sensor to capture individual cow health. That was actually a pretty cool idea, the way they were doing it. An electric toothbrush that would measure and gamify oral hygiene for children. So making use of that gyroscope to measure motion through the mouth, in and around and up and down for however many 20 seconds per side, something like that. Some gloves that would interpret sign language. So that was heavy use of the motion sensing. a sports helmet that would monitor impact forces for continuous player health monitoring, heavy use of the accelerometers, some weight training gloves that would track actual training motions and try to determine which exercises you were doing. And another one that I didn't even write down, but it was a band, like a bracelet or a wristwatch type device that was connected to another, entangled at a distance, spooky action at a distance even. And if you interacted with one, the other would receive some sort of signaling. And it was basically used to say, hey, I'm thinking about you, or whatever. It was, I'm not diminishing it. I'm just saying that whatever the actual interactions were, it was an interesting idea. And the person that was driving that project is, generally speaking, a very inventive character. So that was, I think that one got underplayed. I think it was probably in today's day and age, it would be even more valuable or more interesting than it was perceived at the time. Such is life. All the team members were personable, more than some of the mentors, in fact. And the projects were interesting and compelling, but it became immediately clear to everyone, especially the Intel people internally, that this was not a show about makers, but about entrepreneurs. We took to calling it America's Greatest Entrepreneurs for the duration. It was no longer about making. And it's hard to do compelling television about 3D printing a thing or debugging something, or the whole ideation process and the construction of things if there's a physical component and so on. It's hard to make compelling television about that. It's probably orders of magnitude easier to make compelling YouTube videos about that. And people do that. But making a production for commercial television, even though it was TBS, pretty much impossible. I mean, honestly, not stuff that people want to watch. So they had to craft a reality show production around what is essentially, I'm not going to use the word boring to mean a bad thing, but it's not the kind of stuff that you're going to make compelling television about. That's just the way it is. That's the nature of the beast. So they had their work cut out for them on the production side, on the TV side. So there were some classes. We had some people in from Berkeley Haas Business School while we were in San Francisco to talk about things like user surveys and pivots and minimally viable products, sometimes called MVPs and whatnot, cementing the notion that we were producing a reality show about entrepreneurs developing hardware products, not makers developing hardware projects. Those are different things. I will say these were interesting and gave the classes, they were interesting and gave me and everyone else some things to think about when it comes to entrepreneurialism in general, building things for other people to use if you intend to make them commercial or monetizable, especially when turning a concept into something people would actually use. Wouldn't that be nice? To this day, I still refer to the couch keyboard story, which I may have altered unintentionally over time in telling it, but it still rings true. The very quick version of this, they were describing to people what happens when you make something, especially in an entrepreneurial direction. When you fall in love with your own idea and you don't stop to ask others for their input, sometimes people call this co-creation correctly. So do you ask other people, hey, what do you think of this? Would you use this? What would you change about it? What would you learn from this if you started using it and found, whatever. There's a whole co-creation process, different expectations and different access to the different parts of the development process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the example I gave was the Haas people were in some sort of a forum with an audience, and they had someone who had developed a product, and it was a personal investment, something like $500,000, whatever it was. And it was essentially a two-sided keyboard that would drape around your neck. You could be sitting on a couch, for example, watching TV, so that your hands could rest on your torso with your fingers on the keyboard. So half a keyboard per hand, right? Draped around your neck, so you could plop down on your couch watching TV or whatever. And suppose you wanted to text somebody or do whatever you're doing with the keyboard. Presumably the phone would also be mounted, like maybe a head-mounted, who knows how that would work out. But the keyboard, you could type your messages and so on. They asked people in the audience if anyone would find this an attractive and appealing product, would they rush out and go get it? And the general consensus was, no, not really. So the take home was, you should start early getting feedback from people. Like, hey, I have this idea for a keyboard that splits and this, and it would do this and that. And if people are like, don't spend $500,000 developing it. Spend it on something else. The most valuable part of this initial classroom work from the perspective of the contestants, though, this started right there on the production set at Tech Stars. What did I write there? Tech Shop. I wrote Tech Stars. Tech Shop was the initial work on building a presentation to tell a compelling story and impress the judges. That's the end of the day, right? When you're pitching a startup to potential investors, when you're pitching your maker entrepreneurial project to a panel of judges and there's money on the line. In both cases, there was a check to be received by the winner. I think there were some smaller checks for the second and third place. I don't recall, but I know there was a winner. I think it was like $1 million. So 2 bad keyboard designs was the initial work on building a presentation to win, but also to make good television, but also to tell a good story. So you got to tell a compelling story, whether it's judges or potential funding or potential customers, potential partners, potential employees, co-founders, etc. Being able to tell a good story is important, and you should be able to impart the driving passions, the origin story, etc. to get to the, and I believe they referred to it during the Haas presentations as the lean in or the aha. The lean in is where people hear your idea, and at some point while you're talking, they lean. Okay, I want to make sure there's fewer inches between you and your story and me and my ears. So reaching the lean in or the aha moment where somebody will I see what you're trying to. Okay, let me get my checkbook. That kind of thing. Definitely leaned into the America's Greatest Entrepreneurs notion, the reality of this reality show, but ultimately quite practical and probably one of, I think for all of the teams, definitely a worthwhile element of the overall production was to learn this practically from people who knew what they were talking about. And the tutoring or the workshopping of presentations continued throughout the production right up until the final days. There was some last minute, run through it one more time, that kind of stuff. And I think that was very useful and productive and probably one of the best, aside from the overall experience, but if you had to pick like a bulleted list of things, that one would rank right up there with like, here are some things to do if you need to tell a story to a real audience. Like you may be talking to 20, 30 people in the TV audience, TBS subscribers and their friends. So that's a joke. It was probably like 100. But yeah, I think that was one of the take-home value proposition winners. Now, a couple of things during the production. There were promises made, not promises kept. Promises. So during the time of Techstars, someone from our group at Intel, who will remain nameless here, presented to all of the teams a plan to deliver a version of the Arduino 101 board that was about the size of a quarter of a US 25-cent piece, aimed squarely at wearables and which would fit and look much nicer in all of the projects than the Uno size 101 board. I think it was called the Orb, O-R-B. This was good and it would make for a much more presentable finale. Getting on stage and showing your product or any showing, they had some like a vignette studio and they were doing kind of a close up on the individual projects during the final week when they were filming the stage presentations and judging and eventual winners and so on. So if you're going to present your product at the end of this, I think it was like a 12-week cycle. Ideally, you're going to show them something where you can focus on the product and not say, oh, why is that board sticking out with all those wires? Or why does it look so weird? Why is it the size of a deck of cards on your wrist? That's not good. So having this orb was going to fit generally into the reality of this reality show, which was I'm building a product that you would wear on your wrist, not one that is ridiculously oversized and not convincing. This was good and would make for just a better thing. Unfortunately, it became clear that this little board was so far behind schedule that it would simply not happen for the production schedule. It probably never happened at all. I don't even know if they had any working version of this board ever. Not only was this unfortunate from a visual presentation perspective, no, we're going to have to, and in my travels, I had seen enough hackathon projects where somebody had a Uno taped to their back or whatever. Like, it works if you have 2 days and you're, no money, like you're a student and you just want to try an idea out. Perfect. Intel and Burnett Productions, and you're going to have people getting up with that? No. And plus, this promise was made. It represented an empty promise by Intel, and Intel prided itself at the time on being among the most ethical companies to work with. And you know what happens when you break promises and become less trustworthy? Maybe that's how Intel got where they are today. Who knows? No comment. But this really irked me. It really, really irked me because they were basically having us repeat the same promises. Okay, build around this, we're going to have that. Oh, they didn't mean any of those things. That was very frustrating. So as I was the product mentor of sorts, I don't know what my actual title was, something like that. For all of the teams, I felt the need to advocate on their behalf in this kerfuffle. There were a lot of phone calls. There was a lot of me getting kind of angry, definitely yelling up. It was a production move that was only rivaled. That is not the way you spell rivaled, is it? Maybe. Inside Intel by the team who built with a T, not a D. Thank you. Who built and launched the first Arduino compatible product that Intel was selling, Galileo. I think they did it in about 30 days. We did this in about 5 weeks. Total 5 weeks. I think the actual hardware hackery was 3 weeks, but they started with a working product. Galileo was, anyway, I made a lot of noise until our team agreed to relay out, that is, take the existing design and change the shape, relay out the Arduino 101 in a tiny, tiny form factor about the size of the promised orb. I can't remember the exact dimensions, but figure like not a 50-cent piece, not a Kennedy half or a Morgan half, no, Morgan dollars. Not the size of a Kennedy half, but also maybe slightly bigger than a 25-cent quarter, US quarter. So tiny form factor, essentially the same board as the Arduino 101, but that tiny size. Definitely would fit inside of a wrist-mounted wearable. Definitely would fit inside of the toothbrush project. Definitely would fit inside of the entangled wristband bracelet thing, which I don't remember the name of. Definitely would fit inside the helmet-mounted device and so on. So this was a way of substantially better, and even for the most part, a delivery on this promise. So in about 5 weeks, we had boards to hand to the teams to fit into their minimally viable products to use on camera. They were fully functioning. They were not mock-ups. But since they matched the Arduino 101, the prototypes built on the 101 would move over easily. Of course, these are famous last words, but I think this was generally true. And again, that I2S signal, I want to say that we did bring it out on this board because that seems like the thing I would have pointed out to people. Like, it is in the specification and there is one team at least that's going to use it. We should do that. So we probably did. I have one of those boards somewhere. I couldn't tell you where. It's in a box somewhere, but I do have one of the didn't ever see the light of day, not a shipping product. And sometime later, I got a phone call from the people at Intel that manage this. They said, I'm not even kidding. I'm sending you a, not a toe tag, but like a price tag, like a little tag with a little hole and a little piece of string that loops around. I need you to put this on the product. I don't know if there was like a mounting hole, but I had to somehow attach this to the product because it was not a shipping product. So it had to be marked as prototype only, not for resale, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the thing that I made a case out of, was that Intel was ethical enough and on top of details for their products enough so that even non-shipping products would get the proper markings and be labeled as such and accounted for and all that. But they could stand up in front of these teams and make this promise and then completely bail and not deliver. So to me, that was reprehensible. And that's what it was. So we also made house calls. In an unheard of move, Intel paid the team mentors, including myself, to visit the teams where they lived or worked to offer in-person support through their development timeline and the production schedule of the TV show. I myself visited 2 of the teams of my 3. A schedule conflict had my third team receive a visit from another mentor, but everything worked out. Ultimately, the newness of the Arduino 101 platform and the Curie itself, or the Quark SE on which it was based, so the Curie project, Quark SE product, also no longer a long end of life, made on-site support tricky because we were all learning together. Sometimes I had to go with, it might be this. But there were some mentors focused on mechanical design to help with prototyping and MVP assemblies, minimally viable product, and others to help with some other specific areas. So not every mentor was like a general help with your project. Some were specifically about prototypes and other areas. And I don't remember. I think one was an industrial designer, one was a mechanical designer, things like this. So there was some specific vertical focus, and then the team mentors. Anyway, it all worked out. We would visit them at home, and honestly, it was a ridiculous resource allocation. Sending individual, probably making pretty good money. If you're a contractor, paid by the hour or however they were billing. For me as an employee, I was traveling anyway, so that was not a big deal. But generally speaking, sending people to developer homes and workplaces because you don't have your documentation in any sort of working order is noteworthy. It was cool. It was cool to visit people. My two teams it was very interesting and cool to get to know them, and parents in one case. So good, but not the way a real company would do business. So kind of an experience. And then there were the finals. So making the actual episodes happened in a production studio in LA with lights, camera, and maybe a little bit of action. There were food trucks, craft services, a dairy cow for one of the projects. We had an actual cow on set. We visited the Donut Man in San Dimas from my college days to get some strawberry donuts for everybody. And we watched the teams get knocked out one by one until there was a final winner. That was fun and not fun. The overall production, all down to the recording of the episode segments on stage. So during the 12 weeks or so, whatever it was, the various production crews had gone out to visit the teams just as we did to get background or B-roll footage. Now, those were completely not synchronized. So you would think, let's take the film crew, the video crew, and they can be there. By the way, there's some sort of demolition going on outside. So if you hear this machinery and beeping, if you can hear that beeping, my apologies. They didn't ask me permission for this. So we didn't coordinate the filming of B-roll footage. Hey, here's the story of this team or this project. Here's the inspiration, all that background information. It would have been interesting to coordinate with the on-site support from the mentors and so on. That didn't happen. So it is what it is. There were tributary productions also by third parties in the maker space itself, and also at the production soundstage at the end. There was additional B-roll about the technologies used in the various projects with a team vignette. So there was like a little mini set, and they could, with cameras and mics and so on, and they could talk to individual teams about the details of their project. And they had the final, because it was the final week. And so they had whatever they were going to be showing on stage and presenting to judges and so on. So they could go into detail, a little bit of a background or tear down, etc. So pretty neat, really. Ultimately, a winning team was chosen. And today, looking back, most of the projects were interesting ideas, and yes, compelling, but ultimately misguided by the reality show format. And a company, Intel, that was not at all geared for small production like this. I mean, small projects. Intel, and we found this in I found this in my whole hackathon journey and their attempts to make million unit pricing for one product, like one individual. You could buy one product as though you were buying a million. So the pricing was attractive, but not realistic. Their salespeople had no interest in selling one device to a 15-year-old, right? They are not at all geared for that. Intel was not geared to behave like Arduino and Raspberry Pi and some other maker products. And since this time, more and more companies have ended up making products that fit into this space, whether it's what is it? Adafruit. Thank you. Adafruit, SparkFun, do a lot of this stuff. There's companies that are doing the ESP boards, all the RISC-V stuff in its early days, coming out on little maker boards. What else? There are others. The Raspberry Pi has now got different sizes and different classes of products. So they've kind of diversified their offerings, and there are more people building around these things. So Intel really dipped its toe into this, didn't dip much more than that, and probably somebody found that the maker space is too small. They did not have the Apple mindset, which was let's make sure our computers are in every college bookstore so that students in college are loving their Macintosh computers by the time they enter the job market. So there was not that mindset. So end of the day, the reality show format really didn't do much to help the execution of these different projects. It got some people some attention. It's something to put on the resume. You could point to the videos. You could say, hey, look, we were on TV presenting this idea. And again, yeah, good for the resume, but I don't know that it specifically helped. I believe the $1 million winner didn't really get very far. It didn't help that there was a pandemic a couple of years later. So end of the day, that's the end of the day. The Maker Innovator Group itself was aiming at a place better left back then to Arduino and Raspberry Pi back then. Now, if they were going to do something today, I think there's enough room to do some interesting things, and Arduino and Raspberry Pi have kind of cleared up a better defined and better in general path. Intel could probably work as a supplier, or what we were suggesting at the time was to spin off a nonprofit like Broadcom had done with the Raspberry Pi, and then you could just sell trailing edge parts at a loss, and Intel could have been offering those million unit pricing sales items at real prices instead of artificially, eating the losses internally at a for-profit. Anyway, so they could have done some interesting things. Maybe America's greatest entrepreneurs had to have a talk with Intel and say, hey, you know what you guys could be doing? It is what it is. I think overall, as an experience, definitely worthwhile for me. I think, and again, all the teams, a good experience, not necessarily for their specific projects, but overall as a life experience, I think it was valuable. Being involved in a reality show is not necessarily a super eye opener. Again, not a lot of drama. There isn't much to make compelling television out of. I think if America's Greatest Makers version 2.0 were to kick off tomorrow, it would be 100% YouTube. It would be people creating their own content around their own projects and their own teams. And someone could assemble clip shows, or there could be some interviews. So I think America's Greatest Maker, if it were to exist today, would not be one single production. It certainly wouldn't have the likes of Mark Burnett and Burnett Productions or whatever his company's called now. It would be a completely different undertaking. So if there was a lesson to learn from that, it would be probably don't do it this way. But in the interim, Make Media, the company behind Maker Faire, went bankrupt and then reformed and is now back to having Maker Fairs. There are more people doing online production about these sorts of things. There are people that make YouTube videos about creative production of things, making things. There are people that hang out on social media and post project videos of their robots and embedded things and so on. What was I thinking just now? And Adam Savage has a whole YouTube channel from the Mythbusters days, so he's always doing interesting things. There are tons and tons of people doing non-network or commercial television productions that are much better suited to this. So I think if there's a take-home in general, there's that. And then the focus on entrepreneurialism rather than makers, I think, was kind of a head fake. At some point, somebody realized that nobody's going to know what a maker is, so let's make sure we're going to turn out products that could be based on Intel hardware. So that's a little bit disingenuous. It was kind of disappointing, but again, you can't really make compelling television about the maker journey unless there's something on the line. So is this business going to succeed? Kind of a Shark Tank feel to it. So yeah, I don't know. I think lessons were learned. I know I learned some things from this, and I'm glad I was able to participate in it while I was still at Intel. And that's that. So that was that reality show. And this was a nice long episode. I haven't done a 1 hour episode in a while. And you can probably hear that I need to have some water now. But that's where I'm going to leave it. That was America's Greatest Makers. And that's all I have to say about that. By the way, if you ever want to get into making, or if you have ideas and you want to pursue creativity and innovation and so on, do it. Now is the time. The time is now. Get in on it. Now, getting prototype electronics and so on from China or other countries, that's a different story for hopefully not a dramatic one. into the near term, but yeah, we'll see. So do your thing and turn ideas into action. That's the bottom line. And then if somebody's pointing a camera at you, so much the better. Take care. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.